So this is the fourth lecture of a 7-lecture series on Who Wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls by Rabbi Lawrence Troster of Kesher Israel Congregation in Westchester, New Jersey. Westchester, Pennsylvania. I once gave a lecture in I think it was in Oklahoma, and I kept saying it was Kansas, but anyway, they were okay.
How can we track the Dead Scrolls seas were in Israel now? I mean, it's like you get confused at places. How do we know what's happening there?
Okay, so we're looking at the rules part of the Damascus document. We're going to do a little bit more of the Damascus document, and then we're going to move on. Last time I said we would look at the Pesher Habakkuk today, but instead we're going to look at the Temple Scroll and also at what's called the MMT, which is a really important document. And next week we'll go to the Pesher Scroll. So we've been on page 8 in the material from last week, it began the chapter 15. Is where they begin the discussion of very specific rules, and it begins with the whole issue of swearing oaths, because if you remember, in order to join the community, you have to swear an oath, but they're very careful about the idea of swearing oaths, except for this, and according to the Damascus document, they don't want you to use the divine name, because that, if you break it, that would be a breaking of one of the 10 commandments. So if you turn to page 9, it really talks about the issue of oaths, and similar to, there's a series of rules in the Torah about oaths, and so there's a real expansion of that material found here, and that's true also, as I mentioned last time, in rabbinic literature, that the rabbis really didn't want people making vows or oaths, and there is a distinct difference in Hebrew and in the Torah between a vow, which is a neder, and an oath, which is a shavua. And a shavua is a lot more serious than a vow. But they don't want people doing either one of them, because if you don't live up to it, it's considered a grave sin. Yeah.
So if you don't use the name of God in your vow, what kind of vow can you make?
Well,
on the name of my mother's,
No. I mean, there were certain expressions that people did, but the rabbis really didn't want people to take any vows at all. And it's one of the reasons why we end up with the Jewish idea that if you go to court, you don't swear an oath on a Hebrew Bible, you can affirm. Because if you swear an oath, even inadvertently, if you say something that's wrong, even though you don't know it, it's considered a violation. And the rabbis have this incredible sort of examples of people who inadvertently lied. They didn't know they were lying. They were kind of ludicrous in some ways, and terrible things happened to them. So they really didn't want people doing this. And so what you see here is also a very serious attitude about what kind of oaths that, to stop people from taking oaths. And they go on, they talk about rules regarding purity and rules regarding theft and all kinds of things. If you go to page 10, in chapter 10, it talks about the way in which the community is its judicial setup. So if you take a look on the paragraph where it says, and this is the usage, would somebody like to read that, please?
And this is the usage of the judges of the congregation. 10 men selected of the congregation according to the age, 4 of the tribe of Levi and Aaron, and 6 of Israel, learned in the book of meditation and in the foundations of the covenant from 5 to 20 years.
5 and 20 years.
5 and 20 years old, even unto 60 years old. But none shall be appointed after he be from 60 years old and above to judge the congregation. For through the unfaithfulness of man his days diminished, and And when the wrath of God was kindled against the inhabitants of the earth, he said to remove their minds before they shall complete their tents.
So,
That's why.
In the Bible, originally people lived a long, long time, and then God stopped it and said, the maximum's 120 years. And in the Bible, a normal lifespan is considered to be 70 years. Well, actually 60, and then if you're, lucky or you're good, you get 70. But the point is, they're following that very strictly. And the age 25, by the way, was the time by which they were, in the Torah, the men were counted for the army. So this is the age of the army, so to speak. And but notice the 10 judges, 4 are Levites and Kohanim, and 6 are Israelites. So this is very, very particular. Now, if you take a look at the next paragraph, it talks about purification. In other words, the idea is that they were very strict about what was considered to be appropriate immersion for purification, and these are some of the rules of it. The next paragraph is about the Sabbath. Okay? And notice it says, no man shall do work on the 6th day from the time in which the orb of the sun is distant by its own fullness from the gate wherein it sinks. So, the sun has not yet set. The Sabbath begins, it says, when the sun is fully just above the horizon. That's the moment from which you don't work. You don't wait till it goes down. That's very similar to the rabbinic notion that you don't work from 18 minutes before actual sunset. So they, like the rabbis, had a period before actual sunset by which they deemed Shabbat to have started, even though it isn't technically, the day isn't technically over. So you see a similarity here. But it's interesting how they're using an astronomical observation as they do this. Okay, and it talks about all the things you're not allowed to do. On the Sabbath, no man shall utter a word of folly. None shall demand any debt of his neighbors. None shall judge on matters of property and gain. None shall speak on matters of work and labor to be done on the following morning. No man shall walk in the field to do the work of his affairs on the day of the Sabbath. None shall walk outside his city more than 1,000 cubits. That's an interpretation of a law in the Torah. And of course, the rabbis have a similar thing as well. No man shall eat on the day of the Sabbath, but of that which is prepared, meaning you can't cook on the Sabbath, or perishing in the field. None shall, in other words, if you're out in the field and you're starving, you can cook. None shall eat or drink, but from that which was in the camp. So the rules here are right out of the Torah itself, but like the rabbis, expanded to cover situations that the Torah does not give you. Okay? All right, and that sort of goes on. Rules about the Sabbath, about what you should do or what you shouldn't do. If you go to the page 11, it says, no man shall walk after the animal to feed it outside of his city more than 2,000 cubits. None shall lift his hand to beat the animal with his fist. So, in other words, you are allowed to feed your animals on the Sabbath. But they're putting limits on this, which is quite interesting. Dan?
Yeah, no man shall mingle with others of his own will on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
That's kind of harsh and not very understandable.
Yeah, I don't quite know what it means, to tell you the truth.
I mean, it sounds like services.
No, it does. Well, they actually did have services, but I don't know exactly what that means. Take a look at the next one. He shall not carry out anything of it or bring anything in it. On page 11, the top of the page 21. And then it says, none shall open the cover of a vessel that is pasted on the Sabbath. In other words, want something that's closed, like they probably put something to adhesive of some sort to keep a storage pot closed. No man shall carry on him perfumes to go out and come in on the Sabbath. None shall move in the house on the day of the Sabbath, rock or earth. These are not, a lot of these things are not found in rabbinic tradition necessarily. No nurse shall bear the suckling child to go out and come in on the Sabbath. She can't carry the baby in and out of the house. And no man shall deliver an animal on the day of the Sabbath. And take a look at number 33. This one is really interesting. If an animal falls into a pit or ditch, he shall not raise it on the Sabbath. The rabbinic tradition, you are allowed to get it out if it's going to die. No man shall rest in a place near to the Gentiles on the day of the Sabbath. No man shall profane the Sabbath for the sake of his wealth and gain. And all right, and if any person falls into a gathering of water or a place of fire, he shall not bring him up by a ladder or cord or instrument. Okay, now that's really weird. Like somebody falls into a water or is in a burning building, and you're not allowed to like get a rope or the rabbis would say, forget it. You know, save the guy's life. Use whatever you have to. So they're a lot stricter about their Sabbath rules than rabbinic law is. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Rabbi,
yeah.
How do you reconcile this with the concept of the sacredness of life?
They were not as liberal about this than rabbinic tradition was. That's all I can say. They're different. There's a sliding scale in terms of how meticulous you are about certain things. This group is a group of ascetics and ultra-pious people, and so they go much further in their strictness on the Sabbath than the rabbinic tradition, which is pretty strict, does. Okay? Interestingly enough, on chapter 12, it says, no man shall lie with a woman in the city of the sanctuary to contaminate the city of the sanctuary by their uncleanliness. Now, this means, we will get into this with the temple scroll. They had their own version of what the sacred city should be like in the future. But they're talking here about Jerusalem and the temple compound. And what they're in effect saying is, nobody should have sex in the boundaries of the city at all. Because the Torah does say that after intercourse, the man and the woman are in a state of impurity for the rest of the day. Okay? But the point is, these are really going overboard in this regard. So this is, again, in sexual matters, in purity matters, they are extremely strict. And so if you go through all of this, you'll see this. They deal with kashrut here as well. If you turn over onto page 12, you'll see that in the second paragraph, it says, and this is the rule of the assembly of the towns of Israel, according to these judgments, to separate between the unclean and the clean and the unclean, and to make known the difference between the holy and the profane. So they've been talking about the communities of these people in the various towns. And what we know from Josephus is that they had little groups all over the country. But then it says, and these are the statutes in which the master, this is the third paragraph, shall walk in his commerce with all the living according to statute proper every age. And in accordance with this statute shall the whole seed of Israel walk, and they shall not be cursed. And this is the rule for the assembly of the camps. Now that means Qumran. So there's special rules for the group at Qumran as opposed to the ones who are out in the various towns. And as I think I mentioned to you, very likely is that the Qumran group, if we assume they're all part of the same group, and we assume it's the Essenes, that Qumran was their mother house. And there are, less than 100 people there at any one time, very likely. But there were, according to, I think Josephus, there were about 4,000 Essenes throughout the country, which was not a lot. But they formed little communities all over the place.
But they have a different Messiah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The third Messiah.
Right. The Messiah of Aaron. No, throughout their documents, they don't necessarily talk about Messiah from David. They are headed towards priestly. So don't forget, though, that the word Messiah means the anointed one, and the high priest is called the anointed one in the Torah. The king is later called the anointed one. That's where you get the Davidic Messiah, because the word Messiah just means the anointed one, which is the king in normative early Jewish messianism. But here, it's the high priest. What happens in the rabbinic tradition is the Messiah becomes both the descendant of David and the descendant of Aaron. Okay. All right. So anyway, it talks about the fact that, they are divided up in groups of 10, and where the 10 are, the man who is a priest learned in the book of the meditation shall not depart. According to his word, they shall all be ruled. And if he is not tried in all these matters, in other words, you have a priest who is not knowledgeable, but a man of the Levites is, then the lot shall be cast, and all that enter in the camp shall go out according to his word. So you don't have, in your group of 10, if you don't have you have to have a priest, but if you don't have an educated priest, you go for an educated Levite.
Why didn't they have an educated priest?
Because not all priests were educated. They may have been descendants, but they weren't necessarily properly schooled in the rules. But if there be then it says, and even if, apparently what happens if there's a leper, there's all kinds of rules in the Torah about what happens if a person is afflicted with a skin disease, which, everybody later interprets to be leprosy. So the point is, who's going to do the thing with the leper? Because the leper is supposed to be separated from the community. And it says, even if the priest is a simpleton, it is he that shall lock up the leper, for theirs is the judgment. So even if you have a really dumb priest, he still has to have, because it says so in the Torah, he has to have the responsibility to set the leper apart. There's a kind of analogy to this in the rabbinic tradition about the high priest. What happens if you have on Yom Kippur, the night before Yom Kippur, the high priest is supposed to teach all night so that he doesn't, they have to keep, and they teach him, and they have to keep him busy so he doesn't do anything that would render him impure. And basically it says, if he can teach this, he teaches this. If he can't teach that, but he can teach this, he teaches this. And if he can't teach anything, they teach him. So there's a possibility that a high priest could be an ignoramus, and they would have to walk him through everything. So this is similar to that. Okay, if you take a look on, again, it gets pretty fragmentary. On page 13, it talks about the usage of the settlements of the camps, and again, they're all set up according to this hierarchical structure. So that's the Damascus document. There's a lot of similarities with the community rule. There are some differences. It would appear that in the Damascus document that women could be part of the community. So as Josephus said, there are Essenes who are celibate and there are Essenes who are not. And it seems that you see that difference between the community rule and the Damascus document, that the community rule, it's a celibate group, and the Damascus document is not necessarily so. Okay? Anybody have any questions further about this? Okay, so now for some new material. And you get some pictures tonight, too. So one of the most important scrolls that was found at Qumran was the temple scroll. You've seen this picture before. The interesting thing about the temple scroll is that it was found in a cave number 11, which means that was the 11th cave to be found. And the 11th cave is a half a mile away from the settlement. So some people think it may be not connected to the settlement at all. Most people think that it is. And the temple scrolls you see wasn't in bad shape. It's also it's on the thinnest parchment. They have found fragments of the temple scroll in other caves, but it's one of the most complete scrolls found. And but it wasn't really published until the early 60s by Yigal Yadin. And there's been a lot of discussion about what is this thing. If you take a look at what I've given you, they think that it was composed somewhere between 150 to 125 on the basis of the script in the earliest copy that they have found. It's a fragment called 4Q524. So it's a possibility that the temple scroll precedes the Qumran community, that it came from somebody else. And some people think that the Damascus rule and the community rule and the MMT, they actually were relying on the temple scroll as one of their sources. It could, Vermes believes that it did come from the same community. Of course, he has an earlier date for the community than many of them because he believes the community started around the same time, 150 to 125 approximately. Others feel that the community didn't start till about 80 BCE. But the fascinating thing, and as you see, the Hebrew is late Second Temple Hebrew. It's similar to the Hebrew that's found in the Mishnah. The fascinating things about the temple scroll is it's not a commentary on the Torah. It's written as if it is a Torah. It's written as if it is a revelation that God is giving to Moses. Now, some people, and it covers it goes through the laws that are which in the Torah are equivalent from the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. Doesn't have exactly the same things, but that's its sort of range. So it doesn't have the narrative parts of the Torah, Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, but there's another book from this period called the Book of Jubilees, which also claims to be a revelation, and it covers from the beginning of Genesis through to where the temple scroll starts. So one theory is that if you take the Book of Jubilees and you take the temple scroll, you have a complete alternate Torah. That's the interesting thing about it. Whether, in fact, that is the case is not 100%. And if you take a look at the content, it covers everything, like from the time of the Ten Commandments, the covenant between God and Israel, the building of the temple. It goes through the real description of the temple. It talks about the calendar of the sacrifices. That's like Leviticus 23 and Parshat Pinchas in the book of Numbers. The building of the temple courtyards, the purity regulations regarding the temple and the city, the purity regulations, and then civil, criminal, and sacred laws. So it's a complete, it's like an alternative Torah. That's one of the most fascinating things about it.
The Book of Jubilees is also found in the...
They have found pieces of the Book of Jubilees, but not anything complete. Before Qumran, we only had Jubilees in later translations, Greek and others. And it was part of what we call the pseudepigrapha. Yeah, Dan.
Seems to me it's sort of like the guide to the Fourth of the Plagues, in that it's a compilation of a bunch of laws and so on. It could be someone's summary of the Torah.
It's more than that. It's not a summary because we actually, there are things in Second Temple literature which are paraphrases of biblical texts. Like there's a text they found in Qumran called the Genesis Apocryphon, which is a kind of paraphrase of all the stories of Genesis. But this does not, it's not that. It's as if somebody set out to write a new Torah. And yes, there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. And what I'm going to give you the example is, I'm going to give you an example of the description of the temple. This is one of the most critical things that you see, is how it describes how the temple should be and what it should look like is completely different than what was actually going on at the time.
But there, I don't see any of the stories.
No, this is just rules. The Book of Jubilees has the stories. That's why some people think that the Jubilees and Temple Scroll together represent a complete alternative Torah. Okay? Because there's a lot of similarities between the Book of Jubilees and the Temple Scroll. So the question is the Temple Scroll a product of the Qumran community, or did it precede them from some other group that we know nothing about? That's an open question. But they evidently venerated it. They had several copies of it, so they obviously venerated it to a certain extent, and it had an influence on them. So it might have come from the earliest circles that ended up starting this community. We don't know. So if we take a look, so here we're going to go through what, sort of temples. So the template for the temples was the tabernacle, described in the book of Exodus from chapter 25. And when you lay out the description of it, this is the layout of it, and it's 150 feet by 75 feet. The measurements here are in cubits. Cubits are 18 inches. A cubit is from your fingertip to your elbow. So that's about 18 inches on average. So this is the size of the tabernacle, and you see this is made out of, because the tabernacle was portable, this outer area is made of stakes with curtain between it, or planks. This is the tabernacle itself, which is a curtain material. It's got a center area, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark is, and then out here is this is the Holy of Holies. This is the holy place. This is the menorah. This is the altar of incense. This is the parochet, the curtain between. This is the table of the showbread. There's another curtain here, and then out in the outer court you have the altar of the where all the sacrifices were done, and you have a laver where the priests would wash their hands and feet. Okay, so that's, according to the Torah, this is what the tabernacle looked like, and the tabernacle is the template for the Solomon's temple. So you notice there's it's a tripartite space: the outer court, the tabernacle, and the Holy of Holies. So the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies, that tripartite structure. Okay, so this is what Solomon's temple looked like from what we know from the books of Kings. And it's 180 by 90 feet and 50 feet high. Okay, and again, it's got a three-part structure. There's an outer porch called the Ulam, and there are two columns. And then there's the holy place called the Heichal. These are lamps. There's no one single menorah. There's a whole bunch of lamps. And then the Holy of Holies, which in there it's called the Devir. And the ark is here, and on either side of the cherubs. You see, in the ark that is described in the tabernacle, the cherubs are on the cover of the ark. But the way it's described in Solomon's temple, they're separate from the ark as sort of freestanding beside the ark. As you can see, there are chambers around it, and there you go. So, okay, so 180 by 90 feet. So it's bigger than the tabernacle. Okay, so the first temple gets destroyed, and the prophet Ezekiel has a vision of the restored temple. This is in chapters 40 to 48 of the book of Ezekiel. He has this vision where this angel leads him through what the temple is going to look like when it's rebuilt. Well, we'll get back to that in a minute, but when the second temple was rebuilt after 500 BCE, it was here and was a relatively small structure. This is the city when the Jews came back. This is what the old city looks like today. That's the walls of the old city today. And this is the part south of the old city called the City of David, the Ir David. And up here is where the temple was, the second temple. It was a relatively small structure here, okay? It was not as large, probably, as Solomon's temple, nor as grand. When Herod rebuilt the temple again during his lifetime, he made one of the largest religious compound in the ancient world. And you'll notice the temple compound is 1,575 by 984 feet. It's huge. And to do that, he had to fill in one of the valleys. And so when you go and you see the walls around what is now the Dome of the Rock and the El Aqsa, that's a platform that was surrounded the original hill and then filled in with debris to raise it up. And on top of that was the temple, and it was really tall and it was huge. But again, it has a tripartite structure. There's the porch, there's the holy place, and there's the Holy of Holies. Very similar. And then when you actually look at this total space, it's also tripartite. The outer court, the inner courts, and the temple structure itself. So Ezekiel's vision has a vision of an incredibly enormous temple. 750 feet by 750 feet. This is what Herod's temple looked like in comparison to Solomon's temple, to the tabernacle. And look how big this thing is. There was another version of this diagram where they put an American football field down here, you know? And so he has this vision of this incredibly gigantic compound around the temple itself. And here's another version of it. This is the temple itself, but then it's part of this larger structure of a sacred compound next to the temple, fields and things like this. It's this vision of, the future. Of course, this never gets built. But what's interesting is when you look at the temple as written in the temple scroll, it's very similar to Ezekiel's vision. And if you take a look at the material, I've given you a text from an article about about the dimensions. The square outer court would be 1,600 cubits on a side. That's about 2,500 feet or half a mile on a side. The total area of the compound would be 160 acres. In comparison, Herod's temple compound, which was the largest artificial esplanade in antiquity, was only about a quarter as big. In addition, the temple described in the temple scroll would be surrounded by a moat 100 cubits wide, 165 feet wide. The total area of the temple compound described in the temple scroll was coincidentally precisely the size of Jerusalem in the 2nd century BCE. The outer court of the temple would stretch all the way from the present-day Damascus Gate in the west to the slopes of Mount Olives in the east. To build the complex described in the temple scroll would recall solving serious topological problems, since it's not flat. Creating a level space on which to build this gigantic project would require as much work as the building project itself. Leveling the ground would require filling in the Kidron Valley to raise it above 250 feet on the east and quarrying rock on the west. This would mean the removal of millions of tons of soil and rock, all by human muscle. A feasible feat, I suppose, but extremely impractical. But after all, practicality was not the Dead Sea sect's forte. So this was an article on the gigantic dimensions of the visionary temple in the temple scroll by a guy named Magen Broshi. So here is what it would have looked like in comparison to the old city today. So you see, this would be the whole compound with the moat. This is the sacred compound and the inner courts in the temple itself. And this is the entire old city today. And any of you who've been there know there's a steep valley here. That's what he's saying, you'd have to fill that valley in. And so it's not a realistic vision. It's a messianic vision. Here's what it would have looked like. There's the moat and everything around it.
Looks like
And here's the temple structure itself would have looked like.
it looked like the one before, looked like the mosque in you all go to the Taj,
To the Mecca.
to the Mecca, yeah, the Mecca.
It's much bigger than that.
Bigger than that?
Huge. Okay, anybody have any questions about the temple scroll? It's one of the most fascinating scrolls and one of the most mysterious. Where did it come from? What did it mean? Was it meant to be an alternative Torah? These are all questions we don't know. But this sect, as I pointed out to you originally, they had a feeling that the world was coming to an end soon. So they had a very apocalyptic vision of the world, that there would be a war between the children of light and the children of darkness, and the children of light would win, and of course they were the children of light. And out of the wreckage and ruin of this final gigantic war, they would build this new Jerusalem. And the idea that there's going to be a new Jerusalem, of course, is a very old idea. And of course, it gets into Christianity. It's in the book of the Apocalypse, the book of Revelations. But it's a very strong part of the Second Temple Jewish tradition, that the Second Temple as existed before, the Temple School was written before Herod built his version of the temple. And even as elaborate and large as Herod's was, it had a certain illegitimacy associated with it. And they were having a vision of what would be perfection. Yes, Dan?
I understand what you said. When they came back, when the Israelites came back from exile,
Yeah.
they rebuilt the temple,
Yeah.
and then Herod rebuilt that temple?
Yes, and probably there were renovations and things between. In other words, we don't know if the temple that was built, the original second temple in the time of Nehemiah, was unchanged through the time till Herod. It's a possibility, but there were probably renovations they wanted, because that's hundreds of years. So there may have been some expansions. Who knows? They have found some walls that are probably from the Hasmonean period. In other words, later than the building, but not from Herod's time. In fact, they know for sure. There's bits and pieces of, what would have been the compound in the time of the Hasmonean kings. Okay? Anybody have any other questions? Okay, so we're going to go on now to what's called the MMT, which is short form for Miksat Maaseh HaTorah, which means in English, some observances of the law. Now, this text has only been found in fragments. It's mostly from the fourth cave, which had a lot of stuff in it. Here's a picture of one of the fragments. So there's a lot of blank spaces. And what you find in the translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls is when it comes to the MMT, they will put a variety of the fragments together and try to create, sort of speculate which texts follow which texts. Okay? So when you look at the outline under the content, the first part of it is a calendar. The second part are special rules. And it's ended with an exhortation. And it's pretty early, dating to around 100 BCE. And the thing about the MMT, it was one of the last major texts to be published. I remember in the mid-'80s, I was taking a class on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the professor had copies of the MMT, even parts of the MMT, even though they hadn't been published yet. So it was one of the last of the major scrolls to be published. And there's a lot of controversy over what exactly is it. It seems, in part of it, to be a letter from the head of the Qumran community to some authority in Jerusalem. Is the person who wrote it the teacher of righteousness, one of the founders of the group? Maybe. Was the authority in Jerusalem one of the Hasmonean rulers? Probably. But because part of it says, you do this, but we do that. And this is why we left. So part of the text is undoubtedly a way of the community saying, why did we leave Jerusalem? Why did we separate ourselves from the rest of the community? Here's why. We think you're doing the wrong thing. Now, some people believe that the authority in Jerusalem is a Pharisee. because it seems the things that they say you do sound a lot like some of the stuff from the rabbis. Lawrence Schifferman, who believes the Qumran group were Sadducees, as you will see, he feels that there are, in early rabbinic literature itself, there are disputes between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the Pharisees were the ancestors of the rabbis, that match some of the disputes in MMT. So he uses that as proof that the Qumran group are a group of dissident Sadducees. That's his opinion, okay? And he's been arguing it his whole career. So what I've given you is the text of the MMT as the translation mostly found online. In fact, completely found online. Some of it is from the Vermes text, some of it's from a different one, and several different fragments put together. There's a lot of gaps because, as you can see, the state of the manuscripts, and so some of this is speculation. Anybody have any questions before we go on about the MMT? It's a very important text, though, because it really does try to tell us why this group did what it did. Okay, so the text begins with a calendar, and we only have part of the calendar. We don't have the beginning of the text, but take a look at the text. Look at the calendar that it says here, and see what you think seems odd about this. It says, on the 16th of the 7th month, Sabbath. On the 23rd, Sabbath. On the 30th, Sabbath. On the 7th of the 3rd month, Sabbath. What is it telling you about that? No, look at the numbers.
7 day sequences.
Yes. Is the Sabbath always on the same day of the month in the Jewish calendar? No. This is not the same calendar we use today. We use what's called a lunisolar calendar, where our months are by our lunar months, but we correct for the fact that the lunar year is much shorter than the solar year. So in order that Passover always remain in the spring, we add an extra month, 7 times in 19 years, I believe. Okay, we add an extra month. We have a leap month, the second month of Adar, which is what we had this past year. Okay, that's why the holidays were so late in coming. Next year, they'll be about 2 weeks earlier. So the Muslim calendar is a completely lunar calendar, which is why Ramadan is never at the same time of the year, but keeps moving around. This is a solar calendar. And that is a big difference. If some Jews were following a lunisolar calendar, and some are following a strictly solar calendar, which also, by the way, requires a few extra days a year because, the way they were counting it, it doesn't come out. They didn't know the actual number of days in a solar year. They didn't know that there, was a 1/4 day so we need a leap day every 4 years. They would add a few extra. Every of their months was 30 days, and then they would add a couple extra days to make up for the differences. But the fact is that if you were following this calendar and everybody else was following a different calendar, Yom Kippur is not going to fall on the same day. Now that's serious, isn't it? But also take a look again. Take a quick look at this, where it says here, the first of the Sabbath Sunday and the second of the Monday and the third are to be added. Those are the days they add to make up the time. Okay, but take a look at look where it says in the first part, on the 15th of it, the Feast of Weeks. That is Shavuot. So the 15th of the second month, right? What? The third month. Right, which is, in the Jewish calendar, the first month, according to the Torah, is Nisan, when Passover is, and the third month is when Shavuot is. So they are following the calendar in the Torah in terms of the days from Passover to Shavuot, But if you go look down, you're going to see some other weird things. You see what I'm talking about? The first of the fourth month, Memorial Day. That's not our Memorial Day. It's some festival that's not in the Torah's calendar. And take a look further down. On the 22nd, all right, the third of it, of the fifth month, is the Feast of Wine. We don't have that in our calendar.
Oh, we should.
And take a look down on the 22nd day of the sixth month, which would be for us the month of Av. The month of Elul. Okay, the month before Rosh Hashanah is the sixth month. The Feast of Oil, and afterwards the offering of wood. So the Qumran people had festivals in addition to the ones in the Torah. Now, did other Jews have these as well? Perhaps. Well, it wouldn't have fallen this. Well, the thing is, what we know is that the notion of the lunar versus the lunisolar wasn't just it. You can see evidence of the multiplicity of calendars going back to biblical texts. We're not sure if everybody was following the same calendar all the time. Like, was the new year in the spring, which is where the Torah says it is, the first of Nisan, or was it in the fall, which is what we do now? Even there's some evidence even in biblical texts that some people were following the notion of a fall new year as opposed to a spring new year. It's really a very, very complicated area, but this definitely shows part of their sectarian tendencies to separate from everybody else is to follow their own calendar and possibly their own festivals. Okay? Anybody have any questions about this at this time? All right, let's, at the bottom of the page, it actually completes and says, the year is complete 364 days. So that was their solar year. And then it goes on, these are some of our regulations, the precepts we all relate to. And if you turn over the page, first of all, they talk about purity and sacrifices. And one of the things is, if Gentiles bring sacrifices to the temple, what is their status? And in fact, in the Second Temple period, Gentiles did bring sacrifices to the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, the temple in Jerusalem under Herod was one of the most famous religious sites in the world. And the temple would receive donations from non-Jews from all over the place. So what is the status of a sacrifice given by a non-Jew? Okay, and so that's what they're trying to do that. They want to make sure that the purity is kept up. Okay, so that's what this whole first part is. And then in line 75, in the latter part of page 3, it talks about the impurity of the dead person. In other words, in the Jewish tradition, a dead body is the most important part of impurity, which is why cemeteries are not on synagogue grounds. And there were no cemeteries close to the temple, at least within the temple compound, no cemeteries. This is complete contrast to Christianity, of course, which did away with the idea of the impurity of the dead, which is why in ancient churches you had people who were buried in the church in a crypt, and why churches often had, I don't think modern churches do this anymore, but older churches had cemeteries right as part of the church property. That's one of the radical differences between Judaism and Christianity on the issue of purity.
They
Yeah.
also had relics.
Yes, pieces of saints that were venerated. In the Jewish tradition, you would never have something like that. The cemeteries are always away. They're set apart. They're outside the town. Okay? Yes, you can go to the famous rabbi's grave or a miracle worker or whatever to give veneration, but you don't take pieces of them and back to your synagogue. So take a look. It says, the dead person, we are of the opinion that every bone, whether it has its flesh or not, should be treated according to the law of the dead or the slain. Meaning, anytime you find a bone, doesn't matter where, it should be treated to the strict laws regarding the dead. He says, then they talk about mixed marriages. And of course, they are against it. You turn over the page, and especially it talks about the fact that the priests are not allowed to be intermarried or be with a woman who's considered corrupt. Then it talks about a little bit about, sort of abominations. And then if you look at line 92, it says, we have segregated ourselves from the rest of the people, mingling in these affairs and associating with them in these things. And you are to be found in our actions deceit or betrayal or evening. For concerning something to you we have written, that you must understand the book of Moses, prophets, and of David. And in the book it is written not to, and further it is written that from the path you shall undergo evil, and it's written and we determine. In other words, if you sort of look at this, there's a lot of gaps, but it's evident you there are doing wrong. You're not following what it says in the Torah and the prophets and the Psalms. And we are, and that's why we separated ourselves. Yes, we are better than you are. That's exactly what they're saying. Okay? And it says, there are curses. First of all, there are blessings in the days of Solomon, son of David, and also the curses which came upon him from Jeroboam, son of Nebat. That is the guy who broke off the northern tribes from Solomon's son. Right up to the exile of Jerusalem and of Zedekiah, king of Jerusalem. That's the last king of Judea before the Babylonian exile. He should bring them in. And we are aware that part of the blessings and curses have occurred that are written in the book of Moses. And this is the end of days, when they go back to Israel. Okay, so he's basically saying, the end is coming. And if you turn over the page, it says, and we also have written you, this is the end of line 112, some of the precepts of the Torah. That's why they called, that's the Maaseh Miksat Maaseh HaTorah, so that's why they named it this. We have written to you some of the precepts of the Torah, which we think are good for you and for your people. For in you, their intellect and knowledge of the Torah, reflect on all these matters and seek from him, so that he may support your counsel and keep you far from the evil scheming and the counsel of Belial. So they're telling this guy in Jerusalem, we're trying to help you. And, you should listen to us. Somebody want to read the next part? So at the end of time?
So that at the end of time you may rejoice in finding that some of our words are true. And it shall be reckoned to you as in justice when you do what is upright and good before him, for your good and that of Israel.
Okay. So let's assume for a moment, the teacher of righteousness wrote this. And he and his group had to leave Jerusalem. They had to segregate themselves. Then part of this may be something that he wrote to whoever was the head religious authority in Jerusalem, the Hasmonean high priest / king, the chief of the Pharisees, and said, look, this is why we separated, because we think you have completely gone off the rails. And if you're smart, you'll listen to us, because the end of days is coming, and if you wait till then, it'll be too late. Yeah, Dan.
Did everybody share this belief in the coming of the end of the world?
It was an extremely common idea in the late Second Temple period, but it goes back to the time of the, it goes back to the the prophets, the last prophets of Israel. A lot of them have apocalyptic visions.
So the old guard in Jerusalem might have expected this to happen too. They were just addressing it differently.
Well, but again, it's a question of when is it going to happen? Is it imminent or not? You see, the theory came out from the book of Daniel, which talks about 4 kingdoms. And when each kingdom is a kingdom that oppressed Israel and then was destroyed in turn, and then there was a second and a third and a fourth, and the fourth is the last. So in the book of Daniel, it's Antiochus, the Seleucid Empire. But Seleucid Empire falls and the Romans take over, and so then things get adjusted that the Romans are the 4th kingdom. I mean, so the question is the 4th kingdom at hand? And so there were a lot of Jews who believed that the end was imminent. So maybe the authorities in Jerusalem felt, well, we're not there yet. We're not anywhere near that. Maybe some of them didn't believe in it, right?
This group felt themselves totally separated from the other people.
Yes, the rest of the Jews.
Right.
They did. They were willing to welcome people in. They were willing to help people. But
They didn't feel any connection, really.
Well, they felt they were the good ones, the saints, and the others were sinners. And they believed that the end was coming soon, and they would be saved, and the others would die and be damned. I mean, I'm using later expressions, but essentially that's what they believed. And so whenever this was written, it's kind of like, okay, you better follow what we're doing. We want to keep you from evil, because you follow what we are, the end of time comes, you'll be okay. And of course, the end of the world did come for them, but not in the way they expected. Okay? Yeah.
Does that phrase, the end of days, appear in the Bible?
Yes, it does. It does. It goes back to an earlier idea called the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a day when God will bring justice to the world and right all the wrongs. And then that evolves into this notion of this apocalyptic ending. There will be a final war between the forces of good and evil, and that will bring to an end the normal course of events. And that becomes a very strong idea in the Second Temple. There's lots of apocalyptic works that are written. Interestingly enough, rabbinic literature does not produce any apocalyptic literature, because the rabbis came through the disasters of the wars against Rome, and they kind of pushed that aside. They put the Messianic era in some indeterminate future, because they saw what happened when they supported the Messianic movement of Bar Kokhba. It was a total, utter disaster. And from that point on, Messianism gets pushed aside, pushed down, but it rears up every once in a while. We've had Messianic movements, in Judaism in the Middle Ages, and then in the early modern period, Shabtai Tzvi, and then the Frankist movement in the 18th century. So we continue to have this popping up in our tradition. Whenever, especially, there's a catastrophe, some people think this is a sign of the end. And the rabbis had a term for it they called the Chavlei Leda, the birth pains of the Messiah. That before the coming of the Messiah, there will be horrible things that will happen. And it's like a woman giving birth. She suffers great pain, but she ends up with a new life. So you have terrible events, but end up with a new world. And, the second Isaiah even talks about a new heaven and a new earth. And that gets picked up by Christianity. Okay? So if you take a look with the rest of what I've given you, this is what Schiffman believes are the similarities that are found in the MMT that is found in early rabbinic literature. So he's quoting here from the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is the earliest rabbinic doctrine, edited around the year 200. So he talks about, first of all, an issue regarding purity laws, but then skip to the next one, which is from the tractate called Yadayim, which means hands, and it's about the purities that can be contracted from your hands. And it says in this Mishnah, chapter 4, paragraph 7, the Sadducees say, "We complain against you, O Pharisees, that you declare an uninterrupted flow of liquid to be clean." This is very technical purity stuff, and this seems to match the opinion in the MMT that an uninterrupted flow can be impure. Okay, but Pharisaic law, which became rabbinic law, says that it can be pure. This has to do with issues, all kinds of very technical purity law issues. And then if you take a look in the tractate it's called Toharot, which is about purity laws, these are opinions that if you match them against the material in the MMT shows an opposite. And since the people associated in the rabbinic literature are called Sadducees, this is why Schiffman believes that the Qumran people are essentially a group of Sadducees. And if you take a look at Mishnah Yadayim 4:6, again he says, the Sadducees say, "We complain against you, O Pharisees, because you say that the Holy Scripture renders the hands unclean." The rabbis believed that anything that was part of the Bible, the Jewish Bible, could contract impurity from an impure source, like if it came in contact with a dead body, and then transmit that impurity to your hands. But a book that is not sacred doesn't do that. Okay? Why do you think they say that a sacred book? Because it's akin to being a living body. Right? You touch a corpse and then you shake hands with somebody else, you transmit the impurity. So it's kind of like as if the Holy Book is like a person. Okay? But then it says, but the books of the Hamiram, and this probably means, non-canonical books, do not convey uncleanness to the hands. Apparently, the Sadducees believe that any book can render unclean. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the last of the Pharisees and the first of the rabbis, so to speak, "We have nothing against the Pharisees excepting this." What is this? This is your biggest complaint you have? "Behold, they say that the bones of an ass are clean, and yet the bones of the Yochanan the high priest are unclean." Well, it's true, A human dead body transmits impurity. The bone of a non-kosher animal doesn't. Okay? They said to him, "Proportionate to the love for them, so is their uncleanliness, so that nobody should make spoons out of the bones of his father or mother." People used human bones, by the way, for all kinds of things. He said to them, "So also the Holy Scriptures, proportionate to the love for them, so is their uncleanliness. The books of Hamiram, which are not precious, do not convey uncleanliness to the hands." So, as I said, the MMT is quite fascinating, and scholars, of course, go through this meticulously, looking at every single word and checking against biblical stuff and other texts. But it's part of this series of texts that we have been looking at, which shows the sectarian character of the group at Qumran. That's my main point. That when we look at what constitutes a sect, and what does it that separates them from other groups or from the general mass of the Jewish people, you see that it focuses on certain things. It focuses on purity laws, it focuses on calendar, and it focuses on the temple and things like the Sabbath. And so these most critical areas of law, of Jewish law and ritual, are the ones which cause the most disagreement and the ones that create the barriers. And as you see, as I said with the calendar thing, if you really have a serious disagreement about a calendar, that is really going to separate you from everybody else, isn't it? And when we look at the Pesher Habakkuk, we are actually going to see an incident reported where the high priest in Jerusalem comes to the Qumran community on their Yom Kippur to attack them, okay, and insult them. All right? Yes, Dan?
Is there any difference in this community in terms of patrilineal descent?
Yes, they believed, as all Jews did at that point, that descent came down through the father. It was the rabbinic tradition that changed it to descent through the mother. It's in the Mishnah, so it's later, and we don't know why they did it. I mean, there's all kinds of potential explanations as to why the rabbis switched from patrilineal to matrilineal, and you could probably think of a half a dozen right here. And if you really fully examine each one of those reasons, we cannot say for sure because the rabbis never explain why they did it. I mean, people have made analogies to Roman law. People have talked about all kinds of things. You always know who your mother is. You know, you don't know. None of these things are mentioned in the rabbinic texts. And arguments can be mounted against every single potential argument. There's a whole book about this written by my teacher, Shai Cohen, where he goes through, part of the book, he goes through every single discussion. He analyzes the Mishnaic text on this, and then goes through every explanation and finds every single one of them without sufficient evidence and comes to the conclusion, we just don't know. But when you look at Second Temple literature, it's pretty evident that descent comes through the father. That's the story. Okay? Anybody have any other questions? Yes, Norma.
We keep like the Levites and the Israelites and
That's through the father, right? That's the original. That all in Israelite law, going back to the Torah, all descent comes through the father. What tribe you belong to, and whether you're an Israelite or not. If you know, that's the way it goes. Anybody have any other questions or comments tonight? So we will not meet next week.